Hi everyone, this is Dr. Amy Hogan, and I'm going to be talking to you about attribution theory. Everyone has a general theory of human behaviour, and this is called naive psychology. We try to search for explanations for people's behaviour, and in doing so, we look at people's personality traits and the situation or the context in which that occurs. And this is the basic idea of attributions. So, defined, attributions are the process by which people use information to make inferences about the causes of behaviours or event. So why? Why do we try to explain people's behaviours? Well, one reason is that we need to form a coherent view of the world. We try as naive scientists to come up with explanations of why people do things. The second related reason is that in doing so, we try to gain control of the environment. So, being able to explain and or predict someone's behaviour satisfies both of these needs. There are two types of attributions we're going to make, either internal or external attribution. Internal attributions are factors internal to the person. External attributions are factors that are external to the person. So for example, imagine you are coming into a meeting room and you don't notice that there's a rug rucked up and you trip as you fall into the room. What are some of the reasons that you might give for your own behaviour? Take a moment to have a think. So some of those reasons you've come up with will fall likely into either internal or external attributions. For example, you might explain yourself as having a clumsy personality, or perhaps you're just feeling tired that day, and so on. All these would be examples of internal attributions, things that are internal to you. So personality traits, your mood, your attitudes towards something, your skills, your abilities, your efforts. It's to do with the individual person. Some of the other reasons you might have given for tripping over are things that are external to you. Perhaps it was just bad luck that you didn't see that the rug was under your feet. Maybe someone else caused the situation. So other situational factors could be at play, things that are external to you. So we tend to either give these internal or external attributions. But how and why we make those types of attributions will vary according to at least a couple of reasons. One thing is stability, and the other thing is controllability. Stability refers to how permanent or consistent the behaviour is. So do you always trip, or was it just a one-off? Do you always do this? Is that behaviour consistent? Is it permanent, or is it unstable? And how you judge that will affect what type of attribution you will make. And similarly, controllability refers to the degree of control you have over the behaviour. So again, if it's something you have control over, then you might make an internal attribution. But if it's something you have no control over, then perhaps you might make an external attribution. So these two factors, stability and controllability, will influence what type of attribution you will make. So following these initial ideas, social psychologists started to expand and develop formal theories of attribution. And we're going to look at two of those theories. The first is the Correspondent Inference theory, and the second is the Covariation principle. So when we pay attention to someone's behaviour and try to explain it, we also pay attention to the consequences of that behaviour. So correspondent inference theory is an inference that the actor's action corresponds to a stable personality characteristic. More simply put, we tend to infer personality traits from an overt action. So if we're seeing a behaviour, then we tend to infer a personal attribution. And this is much more likely if only one plausible explanation exists. And that in that instance, we say that the correspondence is high. Take a moment to have a think of a few examples. For example, let's say you're in a shop and you witness someone's boss come over and berate them for their bad behaviour. If that was the first time that you'd seen that boss be a bit rude to their employee, you're probably more likely to infer that maybe that boss is being a bit rude or bossy. So in the absence of any other explanations, the correspondence is high. That person was being very overtly demanding, perhaps a little bit rude, so you would infer that they have a rude personality. But perhaps if you'd seen that the employee wasn't doing their job very well, or giving other reasons for that boss's bad behaviour, then perhaps the correspondence would be low and you'd be less likely to attribute that bossy behaviour to the personality characteristic. Once again, how we make these inferences will depend on several things. One thing it depends on is social desirability, and a second is choice. So let's have a quick look at social desirability. People are much more likely to make a dispositional attribution about a behaviour that is socially undesirable. So for example, being polite is a social norm. We all try to be as nice as possible. So if that boss went out of their way to perhaps be rude or a bit more aggressive, then that's an undesirable behaviour. So we're much more likely to attribute that to the boss's personality characteristic than to a situational event. Similarly, with choice, actions that are freely chosen are considered to be more indicative of a person's true personal characteristics than those that are forced or coerced. So for example, again in the boss scenario, if they were choosing to berate their employee, it was their own free choice, then we're much more likely to give a dispositional or an internal attribution about that behaviour. But if we were to learn that the boss was told by their boss and forced to berate their employee, then perhaps we would be less likely to say it was that boss's personality characteristics. They were forced to do that behaviour. Now there is a third element that determines what kind of attribution we will make. And the technical term is called non-common effects. Basically, what this is getting at is the behaviour unique? Does it have outcomes that could not be produced by any other actions? So to break this down in a little bit more detail, when we are trying to understand and explain someone else's behaviour, we analyse that behaviour in the context of other potential behaviours. So how else could the boss have acted instead of being rude and bossy to their employee? We then compare the consequences of the chosen behaviour to the consequences of the actions not taken. What happened because the boss was being rude and demeaning to their employee? What would have happened if they had taken a different tact? It was nice instead. And then lastly, we infer the strength of the intention by looking for unique, or in other words, non-common consequences. So what did the boss achieve in that particular circumstance by being rude and demeaning to their employee? Let's give another example. Let's say, once again, you're shopping. You've got lots of different options in terms of where you'd like to shop. So in this example, we're going to be either shopping at the Gap, TJ Maxx, or Old Navy. So there are a number of overlapping qualities from these three stores. So for example, they all have a decent range of clothes available to buy, they're all relatively comfortable, and they all have a certain level of style. But then let's say a person decides to shop at TJ Maxx. They had the option of shopping at all three, but they've chosen to go with TJ Maxx. So we have to ask ourselves, what's unique about TJ Maxx? This is perhaps the only store that offers designer labels. So the non-common effect is the fact that TJ Maxx is the unique situation that only offers designer labels. So perhaps we're going to infer that the person who had the choice to shop at Gap, Old Navy, or TJ Maxx is someone who is swayed by wearing designer label clothes, not going for generic labels at Gap and Old Navy. So that's the basic idea of correspondent inference theory. This theory particularly looks at the causes of a single observation of a behaviour. The second theory, called the covariation principle, tries to come up with reasons for why we explain multiple instances of behaviour. So how do we explain when people do things over multiple times, not just one time? The covariation principle basically says that the cause of a particular behaviour must be present when the behaviour is also present. Or put the other way, the cause must be absent when the behaviour does not occur. So in essence, the cause and the observed effect must covary. Again, take a moment or two to think of some examples. Let's think of an example. Let's say your partner seems to get stressed when their mother-in-law is around. So does your partner only get stressed with the mother-in-law being present? So they are covarying. Or do they also get stressed when other people are around? So there are perhaps other factors that are influencing that behaviour. This is referred to as the discounting principle. When a particular event has several possible causes, we are less likely to attribute that effect to any particular cause. So if your partner gets stressed around lots of other people, then we're less likely to attribute it to just the mother-in-law. When assessing covariation, according to Kelly, there are three things we have to take into account: consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. Let's go through each of these in turn. Consensus is the extent to which others react the same way to the stimulus or entity. So is it just the person acting this way, or do others act the same way? The second is consistency. This is the extent to which the person reacts to the stimulus in the same way, but on other occasions. So again, with the mother-in-law example, does the person, your partner, always get stressed around your mother-in-law? Are they consistent in that behaviour, or do they change? And lastly, distinctiveness is the extent to which a person reacts the same way, but in different situations or different stimuli. So does your partner get stressed with your mother-in-law, and is that a distinctive behaviour, or do they get stressed with other people? Let's work this through with another example. Let's say you're in class one day and someone turns up 30 minutes late for class. Let's use consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness to work out how we would make attributions for this person who is late to class. So consensus would be, do others turn up late for class that day? So if only that one person was late, then perhaps we're more likely to make an internal or a dispositional attribution. But if everyone turned up late to class on that day, then perhaps you're more likely to make a situational attribution. Maybe the traffic was bad, maybe the weather was bad, that's causing everyone to turn up late. Consistency, you'd have to ask, does the person always turn up late for this class? So again, is this a one-off? Does the person usually arrive on time and it's only this class that they've turned up late for? So in that case, you're perhaps more likely to say, well, maybe something in their environment caused them to be late this one time. But if they're always late, then perhaps you're more likely to say, well, this person's not very good at managing their time. They're always late. It's an internal attribution. And then lastly, distinctiveness. Is it only this class that they're late for? Or does the person turn up late for other classes too? So again, if it's only this class that the person is late for, you might make a situational attribution. Maybe they're struggling to get from work to school. Maybe the traffic's bad again. Maybe it's the time of day that's not working for them because they're turning up on time for other classes at different time. Or, alternatively, if they turn up late for every other class, then once again, maybe it's not the situation. Maybe it's the person who's not having very good time managing their time. So you can see how these three factors have a direct impact on how we explain and try to attribute causes for someone's behaviour. So the Correspondent Inference theory and the Covariation principle are two theories that really help us to understand why people do the things that they do. But the problem is that as humans, and we're all prone to error, and there are a couple of biases that we are prone to making in this attribution theory. The first is called the fundamental attribution error. This is the basic idea that when we're trying to explain someone else's behaviour, we tend to overestimate internal causes and underestimate external causes for their behaviour. Let's give the example, let's say you have a problem with your TV and you call your TV provider to complain about the service. And of course you would expect the person on the other end of the phone to be nice to you, but perhaps actually you're met with some very rude behaviour. What's most likely to occur is that when you're explaining that person's rude behaviour, you're much more likely to attribute it to their personality and internal cause rather than explaining it in terms of situational factors. Why? Again, when we make these internal attributions, it tends to give us greater confidence in predicting future behaviour. But it is this desire for predictability that makes us much more susceptible to this error. The second reason why we tend to make this error is that we can focus on the things that are most obvious to us. This is called perceptual salience. When we are talking on the phone to this rude person, we're only really aware of their rude behaviour. We are not aware of perhaps the other things that are going on in their lives that might be causing their rude behaviour. So for example, they might be stressed because they've just lost their job, or their husband is ill, or any other situational factor that could be causing their bad mood that day. We're not aware of those things, but we are aware of their rude behaviour, so we're more likely to attribute it to their personality. So that's the fundamental attribution error. We're trying to explain someone else's behaviour. It's kind of the opposite for the actor-observer effect. When explaining our own behaviour, we tend to attribute causes of our own behavior to external reasons and other behaviors to internal factors. So let's talk about the scenario. Let's say you're in a bar and you're having a drink and a guy approaches you and you're kind of talking and you're being very polite and having a conversation with them. Someone who might be observing that behavior from afar might try and interpret your behavior to internal factors, saying, oh, you're flirting with him, you're talking to him, you're being polite. That's because you're interested, you're attracted to him. But when you try to explain your own behavior, you're perhaps more likely to think about external reasons. Well, the guy asked for directions and I was just being polite because that's what's expected of me in that situation. It's not that I was flirting. So when we're explaining our own behavior, we tend to have the opposite effect to the fundamental attribution error. Why? Because, once again, observers, someone that's trying to explain someone else's behavior, as we've seen already, tend to place greater importance on internal factors. And as actors, when we are doing it personally, we're aware of external factors that perhaps other people aren't aware of. So this relates to perceptual salience once again. We're aware of the external factors if we're stressed that day or other things that might be affecting our behavior than just our personality. And it's interesting that the actor-observer effect actually gets reversed when people are made to be more self-aware. So if people, let's say the interaction between you and this guy was videotaped, directly after the behavior, you're more likely to say, oh, it was external causes, I was just being nice, I was giving him directions. But then if you're made to watch a video of your behavior and you're much more aware of how you are presenting yourself, you're perhaps more likely to make different types of attributions than you were before. And lastly, we're much more likely to, when we're explaining events from long ago, we're much more likely to make personal attributions because the situational factors are less salient in our memory. We kind of forget all those external factors that were affecting our behavior from long ago. So if something was just recently occurred, then the actor-observer effect is much more likely to happen. When we think about explanations for behavior from a long time ago, we're much more likely to adopt the observer perspective. So, in summary, many factors are involved in how and why we try to explain someone's behavior. So, the next time you make a quick judgment about the reasons for someone's behavior, take a quick moment to think why you've made that decision.